Okay, so in this third learning objective, we're just going to look at really a definition of a term in a sense, which is going to help us understand a little bit about the data that we see in macroeconomics. So we're going to just try to understand what persistence in macro data means, which is different than what persistence of an individual would tend to imply, although they're very similar, related. So trying to forecast the macroeconomy is an exercise that I wouldn't highly recommend. So it can both be very easy and it can also be quite difficult. And so as you can imagine, the easy parts we don't actually get a whole lot of value out of, and it's the hard ones that we would, but because they're difficult, if not impossible, it makes forecasting the macroeconomy relatively hard to do. So one of the questions that you're most asked as an economist, so I'm a macroeconomist, and one of the things I'm most asked is what's going to happen to the economy, right? So in the past year or two, almost all of the questions I've got from non-economists have been, when are we going to have another recession? And I never have a really good answer for that, and there's good reasons for it. And it has to do with what we call persistence, persistence in the data. And so what we mean by persistence is that the value of a variable today tells me a lot about the value of the variable in the future. So the value today tells me a lot about the value tomorrow, or in some future period. That's what we mean by persistence. So I'm going to kind of, draw some graphs of a variable. And so if I think of something that has low persistence, a really good example would be a coin flip. And so if I said heads made my variable equal to 1, and tails made my variable equal to -1. And I wanted to predict next flip, what is the value of my variable going to be? Well, this has very low persistence in that whether or not I flipped a head or a tail today, or in this flip, tells me nothing about the value that I'm going to get in the next flip. So if I was to plot this out, right, so if I put -1, 0, and 1, and I looked at the number of flips, and I plotted out, okay, so maybe I start off and I get heads, heads, tails, head, tails, 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 head, tails, head, head, tails, 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 head, etc. Right? So I would get all random combinations here of heads and tails, and if I kind of plotted out my data, it would be very jaggedy, meaning it's tending to go up and down very frequently. And whether I'm at a 1 or a -1, it doesn't tell me anything in particular about what's going to happen next. It's very unpredictable. There's no way I can guess, other than sheer luck, whether it's going to be heads or tails in the next flip. That is a low persistence type of series. Now, something that has more high persistence means that I am able to predict the value that is going to come next. So something that has high persistence tends to be things like the weather. And in particular, the temperature in our climate tends to be relatively persistent, right? If I know the temperature today, the temperature tomorrow is going to be somewhere around that, right? So if I was to plot out the temperature over time, it's going to be a much smoother graph than my coin flip one. And that is something that has high persistence. So if the temperature today was 50 degrees Fahrenheit, I know that the temperature tomorrow is going to be somewhere around 50 degrees, right? So it's going to go up for a while, It may decrease. We get a cold spell. The cold spell lasts for a little bit. It increases, etc. That is something that has high persistence. The value of it today tells me a lot about what the value is going to be tomorrow. Now, most macro data follows a type of data that has high persistence. So when the economy is growing, it tends to continue growing. So if you remember my graph of business cycles, so we can just take real GDP, for example. And here's the trend. When the economy is growing, it tends to keep growing for a long period of time. So in our most recent example, we had about 11 years of the economy growing at a relatively constant rate. So that's when I say it's kind of easy to make forecasts of GDP. I can take the value that we had last quarter, add the average growth rate to it, and I've got a pretty good prediction of what GDP is going to be next quarter, and that's because it's persistent. It's not at all like the coin flip, right? Except when we get to the turning point, which is where it gets difficult, right? So once the economy starts shrinking, it's going to tend to stay shrinking for a while. So if I was to stick with this 2009, 2020, where we had increasing real GDP, and then all of a sudden now it's going to decrease. And once it decreases, it's going to tend to decrease for a while. Doesn't necessarily have to, but that's been the pattern. So when we say the data is persistent, real GDP is persistent, it means that once it starts shrinking, it's going to tend to shrink for a while. Once it's growing, it's going to grow for a while. And that makes the prediction part within an expansion or a recession relatively easy. What makes it hard, nearly impossible, is to predict this turning point. That effectively is like trying to predict a coin flip. So there are certain things we can look for, but it becomes very hard to know exactly when we're going to switch from expansion to recession. Outside of that turning point, prediction is very easy. Now that the economy has started to slide and unemployment rate is going up, I can make pretty good predictions about what the unemployment rate will be next month. If it's 16% right now, it's probably going to be slightly higher than that next month. Unless, of course, we hit a turning point, in which case I'm going to be off slightly, and then I can make the predictions going from there. It'll be a relatively persistent decrease in the unemployment rate. So that really is just a definition, in some sense, of persistence, but one that's very useful for thinking about both forecasting and macroeconomics and the general nature of the data that we are working with. So up next, we'll look into the Great Depression.